when Dan first invited me to come down here, I said, I don't really know very much about the Verde Valley. And he said, it's okay, we want you to talk about the Colorado River Basin. So I have faith that it's okay that I'm not going to talk to you about the Verde Valley, because I get the sense that you all know a lot more than I do about that topic. And my hope is that in giving you some sort of big picture view of what's happening at a sort of macro level across the watershed that you live in too, you're in the Colorado River Basin, that maybe in that you hear some things you like or don't like, or some things that you can take and use for your own success here in the Verde Valley, or maybe not, maybe it's just stories today. I will also say that I come here with a little bit of trepidation. My bread and butter work for the last 16 years at EDF has been working on restoration of the Colorado River Delta. That sits right down at the US-Mexico border. And so usually I get to tell that story, and I get great slides of pictures of the Delta and the birds and the people, the communities. I have a few of those in here. I couldn't help myself, but that's not really what this talk is about. And so I'm heavy on facts and figures and words, and I'm gonna try not to put you to sleep with it, but I apologize in advance for the lack of pretty things to look at in my presentation. So I don't think I need to introduce the Colorado River Basin, but I will anyway, because it's always good to remember just what we're talking about. So it's 7 states in the United States and 2 in Mexico. It's nearly 250,000 square miles. It's 1,400 miles from top to bottom on the main stem. And as you can see in this city, water from the Colorado River serving upwards of 35 million people in cities that aren't even inside the watershed at times, some of them. So Denver, not in the Colorado River Basin, on the other side of the Continental Divide, but exporting water across the mountains. And San Diego, and to the south of there, even Tijuana, bringing water across the watershed boundary out to serve their water needs. So a vast population depending on water from this resource in the 21st century. And that definitely is part of the dynamic that we're facing today in management, which is that's sort of an undeniable need. A population of upwards of 35 million people essentially can't be denied. The other big picture thing you have to know about the Colorado River is that it serves irrigated agriculture. So with Manifest Destiny, our US federal government set up a lot of policies and incentives to get people to move to the West 100 plus years ago, and our economy at that time was predominantly agriculture. So you should not be surprised to hear that 80% of consumptive use of the Colorado River serves irrigated agriculture. And that produces, I've heard a figure of about 15% of the nation's agricultural I don't know if it's revenues, but agricultural economy is based in the Colorado River. And it's very diverse. Up in the upper basin where I live, our agricultural, irrigated ag really in the high mountains supports largely beef production. A lot of pasture and forage is grown with Colorado River water. Here in Arizona, with more sun and milder temperatures year-round, there's different crops that are grown, massive dairies, cotton, even grown in the central Arizona region, and in southern Arizona, a very impressive agricultural economy with produce that I dare say the entire country depends on at times of year. When the rest of the country is dormant and under snow, we're all eating lettuce grown with Colorado River water. So a massive impact nationwide. And of course, I have to remind you that the Colorado River is also a river with some supporting and sort of integral to some features that people across the United States and even across the world have come to know and love. The top picture on the right there is the headwaters of the Colorado River in Rocky Mountain National Park. The center picture should be not unfamiliar to any of you. It's the Grand Canyon here in Arizona. And then at the bottom right, I have to include my beloved Colorado River Delta, where the Colorado River is currently trickling into the sand to its end about 100 miles upstream from the upper Gulf of California, which is where it used to flow to before we developed so much of it. So now to the less picturesque part of my talk. I'm going to give you a little bit of an update on system status, and by that I mean sort of what's up with the water in the Colorado River Basin. I'm going to talk some about risks to water users. I'm going to talk about different management approaches that are emerging today, sort of some of the cutting edge deals. I'm going to try to put that in a little bit in the context of something we call the law of the river, which is every piece of local to state to federal reg, law, compact, treaty that applies to managing water in the Colorado River. But this is not going to be a law school lesson on that. And by the way, I am not an attorney, so if you are looking for legal advice, go somewhere else, not me. And then I'm going to wrap up with just some conclusions that are my observations about where things are going today, sort of how in an incredibly complex and sometimes quite contentious and challenged basin, progress is actually being made, maybe not quite quickly enough yet, but we are seeing some progress made. So my observations, and I'd love to entertain questions or comments from any of you after you've heard what I had to say to see if you have other ideas about what the conclusion should be. So system status. That's my view from the airplane window this morning. There is some snow in the mountains. However, I don't believe we've hit quote unquote normal for this year. It was an early flight. I had to get up early. I took a little nap. I don't actually know what I was looking at when I took this picture, but I thought, oh, there's snow. I should take a picture. These folks would like to see that. So this is what a federal agency or a federal office, I think of NOAA, called the National Oceanographic and Aerospace Agency, probably from the National Weather Service, has an office they call the Colorado River Basin Forecast Center that water managers all over the basin rely on to give us our read on sort of how is the winter going, right? So most of our precip occurs as snow in the mountains. And so it's how's the snowpack for the year? That's your answer to how's this year's climate treating us. So I believe what we have is the purple-ish line. Probably this one is the median from 1981 to 2010. The average is the blue line, so not that far off. And that's, so median and average, right? So the middle value and the mean value. And then we have 2015 and 2014. And so the key thing that I think that I really want to point out is that where we are today, and I think this is, what date did I get? It was, I think I pulled this off the computer this weekend. Yeah, it's created February 2nd. So where we are right now, we've had some storms, but you see a little bit of tailing off of this green line. That's this year. And what that means is that we've had some storms, but it got warm. Sometimes when it gets warm, the snow sublimates. That means it doesn't melt and go into the rivers. It actually goes straight from solid state snow into the atmosphere as water vapor. And that has, we've actually noticed a trend of increasing sublimation over the past decade, or at least that I've been paying attention, as we got this really warm weather through the winter and sometimes quite extremely in March. And we've had years where we thought the snowpack looked pretty good and then the whole thing just kind of vanished. And that's, I am not a climate scientist either, but that's part of what I'm reporting to you on today. So that's what they're reporting for. And this is, oh, by the way, this is snowpack reports aggregated for the entire basin that drains into Lake Powell. which is the bottom end of what we call the upper basin of the Colorado River and the beginning of the large reservoirs in the system. So actually here I can show you the basin, and there is a sort of bucket representation of Lake Powell. And really all I wanted to show you, the numbers here shouldn't concern you, but what I wanted to show you is that we have a storage system in the river, on the Colorado River, that is basically unequaled pretty much anywhere in the world. It stores 4 times the annual average flow of the river. That is massive, massive amount of storage compared to what the river produces in a year. It is currently half empty. You know, the other way to look at it is it's currently half full. We have 2 years of supply in storage, although maybe some of it at the bottom of those reservoirs are not perfectly accessible. But with all that storage, we've actually been able to weather a long drought better, absolutely, than we would have been able to weather it had we not had all that storage. On the other hand, it is concerning to a lot of people right now that we have drained the reservoir system by 50%, a little more than 50% even, and we don't know if we have the regulatory tools in place at this time to put the brakes on in a way that is sort of met with, you know, done through law and order and the law of the river. So we're half empty, half full, half full. So risk to water users, kind of at the macro level. I told you I had to start a little bit with law of the river and risk. And again, this is not a lesson in the law of the river. And I have included some sort of recent changes with that I think bode well for the basin. So I put some dates of when these rules were made. So the first thing to realize is that while you probably heard, if you've been paying attention to water in the papers and looking at sort of Arizona's status, right? Arizona is definitely subject to shortages first and more acutely than other states in the basin. However, in some ways, Arizona is in a privileged position because while there will be shortage, there's also a compact that requires the 4 upper basin states, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming, requires those states to, the language says, not deplete the Colorado River beyond a certain volume, beyond 75 million acre feet in any 10-year period, or you can sort of think of that as 7.5 million acre feet every year is sort of guaranteed to come down here. And in fact, that number might be higher. There's some sort of unresolved disputes in the compact and later agreements involving who has to supply Mexico's treaty allocation. So it might be as much as 82.3 million acre feet that have to be delivered over any 10-year period. At any rate, the upper basin is required to deliver that much, always has never really come yet close to not delivering that amount. But the sort of half-empty reservoir situation, the recent drought, has definitely got people thinking about that obligation in a way that maybe we didn't spend so much time thinking about in the past. Lower basin shortages are tied to elevations at Lake Mead, and I should have pointed out to you that in addition to Powell, the big upper basin reservoir, there is Lake Mead, which you probably have all seen or been in boats on. And as that reservoir drops, and it has been dropping pretty steadily in most years in the last decade, it may eventually hit a particular elevation that was agreed upon in 2007 as the elevation at which the brakes would first get put on and states would not receive their full allocations. And the way that breaks down, and I already mentioned to you that Arizona takes the biggest hit, but the way it breaks down at 1075 is that Nevada takes a shortage of just 13,000 acre feet, and you have to realize that their whole allocation is 300,000 acre feet, so it's sort of proportional to their use of the river is smaller. And in fact, Arizona and Nevada struck a deal whereby Arizona would bank some of its surplus water in exchange for a lot of money. And when the shortage does in fact occur, Arizona will be absorbing the first 1 million acre feet of Nevada's shortage. So I don't know how many times does 13,000 acre feet go into 1 million acre feet, but that many years, Nevada doesn't really have to worry about that first tier of shortage. Arizona's shortage out of a total state allocation of 2.8 million acre feet is 320,000 acre feet, which is really, as I said, 333,000 acre feet because of the additional burden from Arizona. So that's kind of big. I don't want to get into the particulars of what that means in central Arizona. It does particularly hit the Central Arizona Water Conservation District, which is the CAP. They are the junior project in the state, and so they are the one who bear this burden primarily, and that's a whole other talk that you could get someone here to talk to you about for a whole other hour. California, interestingly, doesn't really get hit by these shortages, and that's a deal, that's the product of the deal that was cut in the 60s to get federal authorization and funding to build the Central Arizona project. There's a whole lot of California legislatures back there in Washington, D.C., far outnumbering the number that Arizona sends to D.C. Kind of realities of our American democracy is that the Californians said, well, we're not going to vote to approve and pay for that unless you subordinate your rate to ours. So that's the deal that was cut. And California basically doesn't take a shortage, but there's going to be more on that later too. In 2012, another deal came along that got Mexico into a formal agreement, at least for a temporary time period, on sharing some of the shortage. They had since the 1944 treaty that we have with Mexico on water, they had, that treaty says Mexico's water delivery will be reduced proportionately in times of extraordinary drought, but nobody ever defined extraordinary drought, and nobody ever said by how much or how are we going to calculate anything. And so this rulemaking or this agreement that was signed in 2012, where Mexico voluntarily agreed to take shortages, at least for a temporary time period, that may be renewed. So they take 50,000 acre feet. When you get to mean 1050, which is 25 feet lower in the reservoir, there's sort of same set of organizations or entities get cut back even more, 1025 even more. Okay, I told you I was going to get a little fact and figures. So what's the short-term risk? This is a chart showing you the elevation at Lake Mead, 1075, that's your number. That's where we're going to hit shortages. And that's actually here in the line marked for you very clearly. Here's where we are today. Well, I guess we're over here. December, does that go down to December? I thought we had a January. This is the January projection. At any rate, what you see with the three lines that diverge going out into the future is the most probable projection in the middle, the 90th percentile probability and the 10th percentile probability. So as you see, by this summer, we are skirting 1075. We're pretty tight, I don't know if it's going to be above or below. And then as you get a year out, and this is a 24-month projection, as you get a year out, there's a lot of uncertainty about the hydrology, and so we don't know exactly where the lake will be, but there's projections that show that we could easily hit a shortage condition. And I'm not going to tell you exactly how they make that determination that the following year will be in a shortage. It's not just that the day we hit 1075, a shortage is turned on. They give the water agency some time to prepare. But this has never happened in the lower basin. And it's going to be very interesting to see what happens if and when we get there. And I will say that as a sort of observer of what's been happening in the basin, watching the approach, which is kind of inexorable, steady downward dive of the lake elevations, and sort of what I'm going to talk to you about today is interesting as well, sort of how the agencies are watching this and taking action in the face of this, and what are they doing? The upper basin also is talking about risk. Right now, there is not a risk of, they don't perceive that they are an imminent risk of not meeting their compact obligation to deliver water downstream. So they're not talking about how are we going to curtail our water uses to make sure we're sending enough water downstream, but they are very concerned about being able to generate power out of the Glen Canyon Dam, which is the dam that holds back Lake Powell. There are certainly a lot of customers who got subsidized power, and that matters a lot to them, but they're also using the hydropower revenues to support programs that make it possible for water users up in the upper basin, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico, make it possible for them to continue their uses of water. So an example is there are some endangered species of fish, and the way that the programs have been put together to make sure that we're taking care of those fish, so that we can allow our water users to continue their withdrawals, those programs are funded with money from the hydropower revenues. So, it's not like money's not fungible. In some ways it is, but they very much rely on having those revenues available to keep their system moving without a hiccup. So they're keeping an eye on this. And what this graph tells you, again, into the numbers, is that if you were to repeat the hydrology that we have just seen from 1988 to 2007, so we're not even, in this case, pretending that we know how to forecast to the future. We're just saying, what if it was just like it was in the last couple of decades? Then 20% of the time, Powell would drop below its ability to generate hydropower. And that's a considerable risk, and it has woken up people in the upper basin enough to get them to start thinking proactively about what can they do to mitigate, to manage risk. So this is all still short-term risk. Just a little bit more about sort of the long-term hydrology issue, sort of what do we know about, is it going to snow, basically. If you go to look at the, so 2000 to basically the last 15 years, historically unprecedented drought in the Colorado River Basin with an average annual flow of 12.5 million acre feet. The historical record going back to 1906, when they started with the gauge readings, is 14.8. The number when I started in this work 15 years ago was about 15 million acre feet. That's your annual average flow of the basin. We've learned over time, it's a little lower than that today, and now we have a lot of different ways of looking at it. So in addition to just knowing about the last 14 years, you can go back to 1988, it's a little higher. There were some high flows in the 90s. The Gila down in southern Arizona actually ran, although that wouldn't have counted in the Lee's Ferry calculation. These are all calculations at Lee's Ferry. But there were some wet years in the 90s. And then CC here, that's climate change. So this is what a big federal study published in 2012 said about what climate change means for the basin with the best tools they have available at the time, that their future projection sort of out of, by mid-century is about 13.7 million acre feet. So if this is the hole that we think we started with, and we're moving down to this, or I don't know, maybe it's that, or maybe this is a view from the past. So some really clever scientists have figured out how to use tree rings and the varied growth in forests to tell us about how wet those forests were in the past, and they're using that to reconstruct hydrology and telling us that they think they know enough to tell us how wet or dry the Colorado River Basin was over centuries into the past, when we really have clearly no gauged records. And they're telling us that there was a 50-year dry period in the 12th, or that would be the 12th century, that was 12.7 million acre feet. And, these numbers I know are sort of don't mean a lot to you, except that you can see that perhaps all of them look lower than what our sort of historical average was. And then, I don't know what the politics are of climate change in this room, and I will tell you that there's widely held beliefs all over the spectrum amongst water managers in the Colorado River Basin, but there isn't a water manager out there today who's not saying something's up, because we're seeing variability and trends that we never saw before. So set aside what you think about that sort of polarized issue of climate change, and just realize that in the Colorado River Basin, we don't really know what we're up against. And while we might want to hope for the best, we probably need to be prepared for some of these worst outcomes in terms of what water we have to work with. This is a graphic that was first published in that 2012 federal state cooperative study projecting, showing the historic trends in Colorado River supply, left of the dotted line. This is the 10-year running average supply. It's quite variable, actually, if you think about it. Some years there's a lot of snow. It actually seems to almost move decadally. And some people say that's tied to, actually not just some people, climate scientists say that's tied to pressure systems in the Pacific Ocean, El Nino, La Nina cycles. But the other thing is this sort of steady rise in our demands for Colorado River water as the West was increasingly settled, and shouldn't surprise anybody. So then they have their forecasts out into the future. There's our rising demand, and there's some uncertainty in demand, right? We might all get with the program and install the low flow shower heads and xeriscape our gardens, or we might not, and more people might move out here, fewer people might move out here, we don't know. So they embed some uncertainty into that demand. And then there's the big blue fuzzy line, which is the supply. And those are purposefully imprecise, but the clear thing that is indisputable about those is that there's a lot more demand than there is supply. And now we're talking not just like in your one little place where you want to sort of survey the landscape and say, well, where else could I get water from? We're talking about the Colorado River Basin across the entire inland western United States and extending its supply all the way out to the Southern California coast and the northwestern Mexico coast. So the scale of this is huge. Okay, these got a little wonky. You guys wanted a water talk? It's a little wonky. I'll try not to spend too much time on these, but at least get you to understand what they are. These are probabilities of vulnerabilities that were projected by that federal state study. So this is the probability of the upper basin facing a deficit in their deliveries to Lee Ferry. In other words, what's the probability of a compact call? That's kind of the oversimplified way to say it. And what they did was use dozens of different scenarios, both on supply and on demand. So you've got everything from the historic supply in here to climate change supplies. You've got demands that are sort of, we've all signed up to be members of environmental defense funds, and we're low water users, or we're more profligate water users. And that's all sort of embedded in here in these different lines. But what it shows you is that under most scenarios, there's some probability of a Lee Ferry deficit. And if you look at the two climate change ones that are highlighted here in bold, and I think blue is climate change with rapid growth, and red is climate change with a sort of more modest water-using population. You can see that in both of those cases, if you assume that our water supply is reduced by the climate, then we're up around a 20% probability of required curtailment in the upper basin. So a real vulnerability in the long term, not just that short-term hydropower challenge I was talking about earlier. And then for the lower basin, and sorry, this one's even messier, but it's a starker situation here. So this is the same, here we have years out through 2060, and we have the probability of the vulnerability. This is the probability of a shortage in any of the traces, so any of the sort of crossed supplies with demand. So notice that we are no longer sitting at the bottom of the graph. We are sitting at the top of the graph, and we are hovering around, 90% towards near certain probability that we are sitting in a situation with shortages in the lower basin. So pretty sobering. And then on the right, what we have is those same scenarios expressed a little differently. This is mead elevation. Remember that 1075 is our first shortage threshold. And this cluster of lines is all the 50th percentile probability. This cluster of lines is all the 90th percentile probability, so like at the wettest end of any of the runs. And this is the 10th percentile. And so I just think it's important to see that 50th percentile probability by 2030, we are well in the realm of shortages pretty inevitably. So, in some senses, there's a message here that the status quo ain't gonna cut it anymore. We can't just keep doing what we're doing. We can't, and that's ultimately something I think we all have to sort of internalize and address personally as individual human beings. But what I'm going to talk about and where I think it's most important that people are paying attention to it at the institutional level of the agencies that are dealing with the law and dealing with what the releases are out of these big reservoirs and trying to manage all of that. And then it's their job through their member agencies to then communicate with all of us, the people who use the Colorado River water. So management actions. In 2007, something that it might surprise you that we had never had a program to do this before, but for the first time in 2007, the state set up a set of rules whereby lower basin water users who rely on deliveries from Lake Mead could, essentially, they don't like using the word banking, and I'm not even entirely sure why, but essentially store water that they aren't using in a given year, store it in Mead. So here, 2007, we're well into our drought. Mead is already probably a quarter empty. And they say, well, if you can figure out a way not to use all your water, let's create an incentive to not use it. So you can leave some of your water there. There will be some accounting rules, and you can pull it out at a later date if the circumstances are right. Not if we're in a dire shortage situation, but what you have here is a graph of how, or sort of bar chart representing how much the big water-using agencies have already stored. So here's the beginning of some interesting things that water managers are doing. And it's not so much the numbers, but to show you that Southern Nevada Water Authority, Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, the big LA, Chinatown Water District, even the Imperial Irrigation District and Ag District, and the Central Arizona Project are all storing water in Mead. These kind of represent some 2013 total levels, what they've stored and released since the program started, end of year balances. That's not so important as to say that the net result of this is that today we have more or less 1 million acre feet stored in Mead that wouldn't otherwise be there were it not for this program. So what does that mean? I was talking before in terms of feet and elevation, 1075 being our set. So every 100,000 acre feet of water is roughly a foot in the reservoir. It changes, the reservoirs are teacup shaped, so that changes on your way down, but rule of thumb is roughly a foot. So we have, and actually contributing here and not on the chart is that Mexico, and I will talk a little bit about Mexico in a bit, is storing 300,000 acre feet in Mead as well. So in total, we have about 10 feet that wouldn't otherwise be there. And do you remember when I showed you how close we are to 1075? Like, we would be in shortage. We would have been in shortage for at least a year, if not more, had this program not been initiated. So the federal government is not paying people to store this. This is just set up rules in the reservoir. You can leave your water there, and it's got your name on it. We have an accounting book. We keep records of it, and unless we're in a shortage, you can, under certain rules, take that water back out. So it's like storing it in a bank. Another thing that has happened more recently, as the federal government watched our reservoirs dwindle, the federal government and the states have a kind of interesting relationship on the river where there are certain authorities that the federal government has, but not complete authority. And in many ways, water management is delegated to the states. It varies a little bit, upper basin and lower basin. But Secretary of Interior said, I see a problem coming. You all fix it, or I will be left with no choice but to come up with my rules to fix it. And as you know, in this part of the country, there's nothing like a threat of federal rulemaking to get people motivated to do something. And sometimes, and I think that the Interior Secretary does that very deliberately, says, come up with your rules so I don't have to, but you better get me some rules. So the challenge from Interior is, what if the current drought were to continue into the future? Entirely reasonable proposition, seems to be no end in sight. Have in place a plan by 2015, a memorandum of agreement or similar, so that we don't have to impose one. And the goal is to identify actions that can bend the curve. So this is Interior talking to a bunch of water managers who all they do is look at all those charts all the time. So bending the curve means move the line into the territory that you want it to be in on your graph so that you're not in a water supply shortage. Bend the curve, i.e. reduce the risk of losing power production or being unable to deliver water. So do something about it. So some people have said that what needs to happen in the lower basin is essentially a haircut. As in elsewhere in the basin, the cities, the municipal providers, are junior to the agricultural water users. So this is principally a conversation that has happened amongst the big urban water providers that use Colorado River water in the lower basin. And at the end of 2014, they all signed with the federal government an MOU saying that collectively through 2017, they would make their best efforts to conserve 740,000 acre feet, additional to what we're already seeing in Meade. And so you can see the volumes here. Arizona does have the biggest volume. Metropolitan has a volume here too. Now that's pretty interesting, and I'm going to tell you a couple reasons why it's pretty interesting that California is. One is, if you think back to what I showed you about the risk of different states to water supply shortages, do you remember that California had zero risk? So it's sort of been a holy grail of Arizona to get California on the hook. I wouldn't say that this MOU is California on the hook for shortages. This is them signing up voluntarily to participate in water conservation, essentially to avoid that shortage threshold or to forestall it, to delay it to the best ability that we can. So that's very interesting that we now have California playing. And the other really interesting thing is that if you've been paying any attention to water, you also know that California right now is in their historic drought, right? We've been hearing nonstop about that. And Metropolitan Water District in Southern California gets roughly two-thirds of their supply in sort of better years from the Sierra Nevada, from their state water project. And that supply has been severely curtailed. So for them to say that they can try to conserve even during this very trying time for them is somewhat remarkable. And I'm not saying that they're necessarily doing it internally with conservation in their district, although they are doing some remarkable programs right now. They are paying water users several dollars per square foot to take out turf, to take out their lawns and replace it with something more drought tolerant. But they are also doing deals with agricultural water users who have rights to Colorado River water in California. So they have a bunch of mechanisms that they're using. Southern Nevada Water Authority will also participate, as will the federal government. It's kind of tough for the federal government to help out here. Feds don't have any water rights themselves, but they are going to take management actions that they say can arguably be shown to conserve water in Lake Mead. So that's new, and that's called drought contingency planning. And there's an MOU out there. It's part of public records. I can probably get you the website if you ever wanted to see it. But that's something new. And I will say that Interior received this warmly and said that's great, but also said very explicitly on the record in December at a big Colorado River meeting, that's great, but it is not enough. So I know that the water managers who crafted this deal are back at the table trying to figure out what more they can do through voluntary measures that likely compensate willing participants in deals to create water or conserve water, forbear water use that can be conserved in Mead. In the upper basin, where I hope I made the point that things are not quite as dire as in the lower basin, there is a sort of different approach, and they are trying to get Powell to not drop below that power pool line. I'm actually going to skip down to the bottom here and say the first thing that they have studied doing, and I think are committed to doing if they feel like the situation gets severe enough, and I actually don't know quantitatively what they've decided that would be, is to release some water out of reservoirs that are further up in the basin, much smaller, not as big as Powell, but out of, I think principally what they've been talking about is Flaming Gorge Dam up in Wyoming on the green, to make a release. Now, releasing water from that upper basin reservoir does not create water, right? You're just moving it from one bucket to another bucket, but it will have the impact of showing up in Lake Powell and helping protect the power pool. It will also then cascade more quickly into Mead, which sits right below, and become part of lower basin supply. So you have the upper basin poised to take some actions, somewhat unprecedented, to address this situation. And even more significantly, they are in earnest talking about water banks, in other words, ways to use voluntary market transactions with willing sellers and buyers to conserve water. And that is, here in the lower basin, since 2007, there's been this banking program in Mead. So there's quite a bit of experience in the lower basin with this idea of water conservation, for the system already. But this is somewhat unprecedented in the upper basin. And the same politics that circulate around here about people not wanting to have to give up their water rights, and fear over water rights is pervasive there. So I'd say it's pretty remarkable that we're getting to this point in the conversation as well. And I wanted to make the point that as in the state of Colorado, the conversation has advanced furthest of any of the upper basin states about water banking, that just because I work for a conservation organization and I'm telling you this history, because it's a new mechanism, because we're doing this kind of new approach, and it's the 21st century, and we have a population that wants a healthy ag economy and wants vibrant cities, but also really wants vibrant rivers to support our recreation economy, and frankly, to keep us all happy about the reasons that we moved to these places in the first place. We are building into those discussions, or into the prospective operation of a water bank, ways to manage that water that helps the environment. It doesn't give the water to the environment. It's managing the water from where it's not being used to grow pasture down to Powell in a way that actually creates benefit for fish. It's saying we're going to pay some deliberate attention to how that water moves down the system so that it creates environmental benefit. And in a water management framework that has been sort of mired in a status quo that was designed before we had the sensibilities that we do today about rivers and the environment and the need to manage them deliberately to have them in the shape we want. This is something really new. It's a really new opportunity. How are we doing? All right, you guys, so I haven't really heard anything from you. Are you still with me? Okay. All right, just a little bit more on deals. I think just 2 more slides. System Conservation Pilot Program is another very recent agreement mounted by some of the same agencies that are in the MOU, but without Interior knocking at their door telling them they had to do it. And it's at a much smaller scale. Central Arizona Project, Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, Southern Nevada Water Authority, and Denver Water, 4 big muni wholesalers in the basin, pitched in, I believe, $2.5 million, no, $2 million each, summing $8 million, and the feds put in 3. They came up with a pot total of $11 million to do pilot demonstrations of water conservation. Effectively will be, they're putting out RFPs saying you can create water however you want to, but we expect that the majority of those will be with agricultural users. There's no set price for the water, so it's an RFP. It's kind of like a reverse auction, like you just bid, and I think they're going to take the best offers that they get. We don't know yet what they've gotten. 3/4 of the money will be spent in the lower basin, reflecting the sort of balance of 3 of the 4 agencies are in the lower basin. 1/4 of the money will be spent in the upper basin. And what's really interesting about this is that the water won't be parked in the reservoirs in an account. We were talking before about how water is being banked and you can pull it out when you need it, as long as we're not in a shortage. In this case, it's being turned into system water. You have to kind of just imagine that another snowstorm showed up in the basin and there was another increment of supply. They are not putting their names on this water. And that's pretty remarkable. And this, in fact, preceded, only by a few months, or maybe by a year, but preceded that lower basin MOU. And so this was the first place where you had a California agency voluntarily in the game. So think about this. Metropolitan Water District of Southern California is putting $2 million. I mean, it's a lot of money to me, but for an agency like that, that's not a lot of money. But it's still money into water conservation that arguably they will never see a drop of. And you have to ask yourself, why are they doing that? They are not naive. Believe me, Met is not naive. They're not doing this because they're Pollyannas. So you just have to think about what's in it for them to be participating. So this is the System Conservation Pilot Program. It lasts just 2 years. It's a demonstration. I don't know if it will be extended, but it may be. People have talked about amping, that there could be more money in it. I don't know what the future is. Last deal that I'm going to talk about is the deal that I actually worked quite a bit on, was between the US and Mexico, signed in 2012. And the reason it's in my talk here today is that it got Mexico voluntarily into a shortage agreement so that when mead drops to 1075, Mexico will take reduced delivery, at least through the term of this agreement, which is through 2017. It also, for the first time, gave Mexico the ability to store water in mead. Actually, there was one previous agreement that did, following an earthquake in 2010, but this is very new that they're storing. And interestingly, Mexico, if you think about the river, so stop thinking about all these laws and regs and agencies that I've been talking about, think about the river. At the mouth of the river is all the sediment settling out. It's flat and sandy down there. They have no place to build any storage. So they don't even, it's not because they haven't thought about it or set aside the money to do it. They can't physically do it. So for them, having the ability to store water in mead is huge. They have somewhat different rules than we have in the US. Because they have no other storage, they are given the permission to withdraw some, not all, of their banked water during a shortage. But they did this all voluntarily. They also, in this deal, there are binational joint investments in water conservation, so money coming from both countries to line canals in Mexico that will save water. They also, and this is why I was working on it, agreed to set up an environmental flow program in the delta of the Colorado River, and that resulted in what we called the pulse flow last spring, with a big flush of water going down into the delta for the first time in a long time. As well as some private commitments to send water from NGO side, raising private money to send water to keep trees alive after the big pulse flow. And then a commitment, interestingly, in this agreement, which is short-term, a commitment inside the existing agreement to go back to the table to try to negotiate a successor agreement. It's a lot of new operating rules here, and nobody, I don't think, would have signed up for it if it had been 30 years. It's just too much new to digest for that long of a time frame. So it's 5 years, but with a commitment to go back to the negotiating table to extend, modify, keep on. And I hear loud and clear from both the United States and Mexican officials that they fully intend to see an extension of this agreement, modified quite likely, but an extension with probably some of the same pillars in the agreement that you see right here. So, and I told you I had a few nice slides. This is where I feel comfortable. So this is the pulse flow. This is about 100,000 acre feet being released over 2 months below the last dam on the river into a riverbed that had largely been dry for a long time. And this is the community turning out to play in the river. So, we think about it. Work for Environmental Defense Fund, so I think about, there's 380 species of birds, and there's, this many acres of habitat. Well, guess what? There's a city there called San Luis Rio Colorado. San Luis Rio Colorado. It's a city named after the Colorado River, and they sit on the banks of a dry riverbed. In fact, they complain that the major Mexican interstate, Route 2, that cuts across their city and right over the dry riverbed, they have to pay a toll to cross a dry riverbed. And it's like the joke of the town. But when the river came back, and they knew that the river came back out of a deliberate agreement in rule, in force between their country and us, poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States, those mean people to the north who stole all their water, they came out to celebrate. And in fact, people took kids. Every day I was out there, they were taking kids. There was a river here. These kids had never seen a river there, and they were out there checking it out. Here are just a couple of neat shots. I told you it's 2 months pulse flow. A lot of the water infiltrated into the sand, not surprisingly, but a little bit of the water did make it all the way down to this is a tidal arm coming up. This is the pulse flow coming down, and this is a day in mid-May. And the next day, when the tide came up and the two bodies of water met, as you can see, it wasn't a lot, but that was that symbolically got a lot of people's attention. The Colorado River made it to the sea, and through a deliberate action of the United States and Mexico in a water management agreement. So, I'm really impressed that you're still with me. I only see a few people napping. Thank you for bearing with me. I'm going to give you some of my observations. I don't know if it's going to feel relevant to what you all work on and think about all the time here, but hear me out. The risk, because of the legal framework that we inherited, the risk is not uniform at all. Prior appropriations has this weird sense, being someone who is sort of born in the late 20th century, now living in the 21st century, it has this weird sense of feeling not fair, and yet enough of a student of the law and history to understand why it was set up like it was. And it made a lot of sense at the time, and it's protecting rights that actually a lot of us value. And frankly, I'd rather have the law of the river than have what we used to have, which is if I went and developed a water diversion to serve my mine up in the mountains above Boulder, and then Joe came with another idea for a place to do placer mining up above and diverted the water, I would have gone and either shot him or dynamited his water diversion. So at least we don't solve things that way anymore, but we do have this law that frustrates us. California's engaged, so this one shouldn't surprise you. I kind of hinted at that one before. That's big, that's huge, and I think, I don't know actually how successful Arizona's water leaders are feeling right now for having gotten California engaged. I'm sure they feel like it's not enough, but if you ever have the chance to have conversations with some of the leaders at the CAP or Arizona Department of Water Resources, you might think about mentioning to them that you're impressed by their success at getting California engaged, because this is sort of thought to be impossible in the past. Arizona has been promoting the concept of a structural deficit, that the lower basin's using more water than actually is available to the lower basin, even by law, never mind by fact of how much precip we have in the basin. Certainly, Arizona is cognizant of the fact that in a shortage condition, I don't know what litigation threat is most viable, but there's certain, people will start sharpening those tools when shortages arise. So we've gone for quite a long time now on the Colorado River without a major piece of litigation upsetting the apple cart. And I think there's probably a sense, at least amongst some California players, that it might be worth putting some money in now to just defer that possibility of litigation, which even if they are confident that their rights are secure, will destabilize how we do business on the river. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the vulnerability to the Sierra droughts means that California may desire new flexibility to withdraw their banked water or protection volume, which is the water they've created under that MOU, during shortage conditions. So because the drought is so bad in the Sierra Nevada, and by the way, I heard a report this week that says it's looking as bad. I mean, it's only January, or it's February, but it's only early February, and we still have a bit of winter season left to go, but it's looking bad again in California, no relief. So they may need the flexibility to withdraw some banked water out of Mead, even if the Colorado River is in a shortage condition in Mead. And so California is beginning to try to move into deal-making mode, because if they're not helping others, nobody's going to help them. That's the way this deal-making works. We don't have a judge making the decisions. We don't have the Congress in the DC making the decisions. We have these agencies looking at each other saying, what's my problem? What's your problem? Can we make a deal? Mexico is engaged. So 7 years ago, there were lawsuits crossing the border. And it was abysmal. There was no dialogue. There was a perception of unilateral action on both sides. And the fact that they got this new agreement signed in 2012 is sort of nothing short of miraculous. What it really is a lot of very, very dedicated water managers who are committed to leaving bad history in the past and put a lot of elbow grease, a lot of persistence and dedication into trying to make it through to new understanding and new ways of doing business. So we have Mexico engaged with a voluntary agreement that contains significant benefits for Mexico. But we also know that Mexico is incentivized to participate, because if they didn't sign up for that voluntary shortage, they also know from history that they sit downstream and thus are subject to management upstream, and even potentially subject to having their water rights shorted if there wasn't an agreement in law. And I certainly heard that in the past, people at State Department talking about what can we do, how are we going to short Mexico even if we don't have an agreement with them on this. So Mexico knows, and they were willing to get in this agreement. The Upper Basin is engaged, and the Upper Basin is so they have a 20% probability of losing some hydropower revenues. Not really their water at risk right now, but they're engaged, and they're starting some actions on water conservation. There is this short-term risk to hydropower. It does help them. It's, I haven't even thought through the financial analysis. Is it less expensive to conserve the water and preserve your hydropower revenue, or is it just easier to pay your bill for what you're not getting off hydropower revenue? I'm not sure. But I think the reason you're seeing them positioning themselves into a frame where they're a player and they're in it, even if it's in a very small way, which is appropriate because their risk right now is very small, but they're in it, is because of something that people have called, and I wasn't the one who came up with this, the climate change squeeze. And one more chart, if you'll bear with me. So in the long term, if the water availability in the Colorado River Basin varies, if your average long-term flow, so here we're at a high of 8 million acre feet, and a low of 0. This is the upper basin. The upper basin sits downstream, but the compact says the upper basin will deliver to the lower basin 75 million acre feet every 10 years. So that's pretty much guaranteed. I think what you're seeing is under 7 million acre feet because it's with the shortage volume taken out, the existing shortage rules. Mexico, by treaty, gets a little bit of shortage. You see a little dip, but basically still gets their supply. Right now, the big risk of climate change sits on the shoulders of water users in the upper basin, Colorado, New Mexico, Wyoming, and Utah. As water in this basin, as our snowpack declines, because of the way our law is set up and because of the compact, they are the ones whose supply declines as the overall supply declines. Will this stand over time? I don't know. I'll be a student of our water history just like you will, but this is the big risk that they face. It's not right, it's not today, but it's what they see coming down the pike. And so I'd say that the benefits of them engaging in water conservation for the basin's good today are these piloting actions, partly to gain some experience. Can we do this? How do we actually do it? You know, if you don't irrigate alfalfa in a high elevation pasture for a season, does the roots of the alfalfa actually tap into the aquifer using the same amount of water that it would have used if you irrigated it anyway? I mean, do we know enough about what we're doing to say that we can actually do these things? They're beginning to test it. Do we know that the water that you conserve will actually make it to the reservoir all the way down at Lake Powell? I mean, what about all the intervening users on the river in between? How do we know? You know, we're going to have, we don't know yet how those agreements are going to be structured, but we may need to have them, and they're beginning to think about that now. And then I would say this last line, this reinforcement of the idea in sort of the water culture of the upper basin, that we are all in this together. And our risk may be out several decades, but it's a big risk, and we better start figuring it out now. So generally, and I'm almost done here, I think what I'm seeing is an emerging preference for conservation, voluntary conservation, market-based conservation before shortages. The agencies are putting money on the table today to delay the day that they have a regulated shortage, a regulatory shortage imposed on them. Federalism definitely remains a motivator, but it's the motivator to get the states and the local agencies doing what they need to be doing. The feds are out there saying, make your plans so that I don't have to. There are some people who will tell you, you know, there's going to be a federal takeover, but I think everybody's behaving right now as if they know that there could be circumstances where it would be irresponsible for the federal government not to, in a crisis, come in and do something. But this is a slow train moving down. This crisis is a slow train moving down the tracks. I have a friend who works for Central Arizona Project who says it's a train coming at us at 3 miles an hour, and if we don't get out of the way, it's our own damn fault. So they're beginning to do the right thing. And then multi-jurisdictional agreements can help. These agreements across borders that look not just at your own water rights and your own portfolio, but looking around, seeing what your strengths are and your weaknesses are, your assets and your risks, and the assets and risks of your neighbors. That's where they have been finding solutions. So we're all in it together, can help mitigate varied risks. What I'm seeing is that a defined risk is preferable to an undefined risk. Think of Mexico preferring to know how much they're going to get than to just live downstream of the reservoirs with no rule of law. They're working on the risk, both short-term and long-term. They are beginning to think about the big picture. And they're taking into consideration supplies other than the Colorado River. And by that, I do not mean they are planning to build the Mississippi River pipeline or pull the glaciers down from the Arctic, although certainly that's been on the table in the past. But they're thinking about risk in terms of those other supplies. So in California, they're thinking about how they manage their water supply portfolio, and the Colorado River states are looking at that and thinking about what California needs because of the risk to which they are exposed in the Sierra Nevada. So it's sort of, and I skipped over this one, safety in numbers, which is a little bit the optics of politics, which is all hold hands and start doing these things together, nobody can single us out. You know, it's like, well, all hold hands and jump into the pool at the same time. We're all beginning to move on these water conservation programs together. There's some safety in numbers. I think that's sort of politically what it looks like right now. And I guess my last point is that, and I touched on this in the Mexico agreement and in the water banking in the upper basin, that I do think as we now begin to address changing the status quo, we can't, like, the system will not hold. Climate change or bad water karma or whatever it is we're experiencing is forcing change upon our water management framework. So while we are adjusting it to our new reality, and we are making rules in 2015 or 2014 or 2015 or 2016, we can look around us at the society we want, at the landscape we want. We know we have to respect the law of the past, but we can build agreements for what we want our lives to be like and our children's lives to be like in the future. And we can build the environment into that. And I'm not just saying that because I'm an advocate, or I am saying it because I'm an advocate, but because I just showed you 2 examples of where we are doing that. So I think there's real reason, while this is a scary, ominous story, to also hold some optimism that if we pay attention and we put effort in, we can actually get someplace that we might want to be. So I'll leave you with a picture of the tide water in the Colorado River Delta that was printed years ago in National Geographic, and I always like to end my slides with it and say I'm happy to take questions, and thank you for sticking with me. You are a very patient audience.